All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to start properly now on Beyond Order. We are diving into the first chapter. The chapter just blew me away. So it's an incredible, incredible theme. Great way to start. Very excited. So the format is very simple. This is going to be highly interactive. So firstly, if you have read the chapter, please share what is the most important thing you got from the chapter, okay? In order to share your takeaway from the chapter, go ahead and type exclamation mark. So we'll start by everybody sharing their takeaways, okay? Maybe 2 to 3 minutes or something like that. There are two special presentations we have in the middle. One is by Victor and one is by Roger, okay? But everybody share their takeaways. Once we are done with that, we are going to go directly into breakout rooms. The breakout rooms are going to be moderated. There is going to be a moderator. People with star in front of their name are the moderators. So folks, if you have moderators, if you're not done that, just go ahead and put a star in front of your names. The breakout rooms will run for 30 minutes. And there will be 3 questions, actually 2 questions that all the breakout rooms will use, and 1 question that will be added by the moderator. So after running the breakout rooms for 30 minutes, we'll come back together to share our takeaways, to raise the questions, and then we'll take some general themes that come out from all that we have said, and we will discuss that. All right, so with that, first question for you folks is, have you read the chapter? And if you have read the chapter, say yes, otherwise say no. And if you have read the chapter and I invite you to share your takeaways, go ahead and start typing exclamation marks. And Roger is going to handle all the moderating and emceeing from now on. And I'll be joining you back shortly. Roger, it's all yours.
Yes, sir. All right, everyone. And to start us off, for anyone who would like to share their thoughts, please type in an exclamation point, and we'll just go down the list. That way we can keep track of everyone's ideas. I found this chapter to be pretty deep and pretty intense, but really insightful. So who would like to go first? Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I'll just kind of kick it off here. I mean, I think going into this chapter, I was thinking a lot about the first book and just what sort of chapter 1, Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back, is such a banger of a start to that book. And I think just the lobster became this sort of total meme of the movement. And I think that it was such a sort of banger of a chapter because it allowed the reader to orient themselves kind of as an individual, but then also within the greater societal structures that we live within. And I think that this chapter has that same sort of like banger element to it, in that it's forceful in orienting us as individuals, but also really understands that, hey, we live in social structures. These help us to communicate and also just to make kind of life livable. And so I kind of wanted to start off by sharing a little bit as to why this chapter, I think, spoke to sort of my transformation. And when I first found Peterson, someone recommended the Rogan podcast. I remember where I was when I was first listening to it. And I was someone at the time who I think was really sort of angry at the institutions of the world, that had a lot of sort of pent up nihilism and was just, angry. And the battle toward whatever I thought it was, kind of peace or harmony, just seemed too big to fight. And I think that reading this chapter, I definitely resonated with a couple of the characters. The first being the Environmentalist Girl, which, gosh, I just felt so lucky that she got 45 minutes to talk to Peterson and then ruined it. But I think that I empathize with that attitude of just feeling like this was such a huge fight that was doomed, that was humans' fault, and how that really can kind of seed into your outlook on the world and your viewpoint. And then to contrast that with this waiter, which was kind of the first time in the chapter that I definitely choked up in this waiter that kind of pulls Peterson aside when he's speaking. He's having dinner with his family at a restaurant and thanks him, and really acknowledges his role as a waiter and that he made the most of it, that within this institution that some might say, hey, disregard this, he found strength and found responsibility. He ends that section with a quote that says, he started to see possibility and opportunity where before he was blinded essentially by his pride. He stopped denigrating the social institution he found himself part of and began to play his part properly. And that increment in humility paid off in spades. And I think that kind of reorientation is really part of Peterson's power in allowing us as individuals to reorient and to regain a kind of the power we have from whatever little job that we might be doing that kind of is a throwaway. And that doesn't always last. But I think for me, I remember first hearing Peterson, and I think the work I tried to do after was, hey, how can I build up the institutions? What are the things that I want to say no to? And where are places where I should be taking on responsibility and understanding tradition and paying respect to it? So just some kind of starting off thoughts there.
No, yeah, it's great. Great point. And Jyoti, I'm really curious.
I think Claire said it all. None of us have to speak anymore. I like this book. Now, well, I didn't read the last book. He talks a lot about different things: social bonding, family relationships, and don't denigrate the social institutions. And he said it all. So, as like for the social bonding, I like how he described 3-year-old children start bonding with each other, and if they don't bond with each other, they have psychological problems later on. If a child doesn't have even one friend, then the child has, as he or she grows up, has a lot of psychological problems like anxiety, depression, and what have you. And if a child has a few children with whom he has bonded, he will have problems in employment and in getting a job and keeping it and what have you. So that is very profound. And I do tend to agree with that because it happens in life. Children who are left out, they don't do very well later on in life. Unless somebody comes up to bring them in, it does happen with them. The other thing that he talked about was his significance of family relationships, especially when he and his wife were sick, how his whole extended family came to their rescue. And it meant a lot because it gave them a lot of strength, helped them to heal. And the most important part of the book, of this first chapter, is do not denigrate the social institutions because they have been set up, they have been established for a long time, and they are stable. And if you don't like something about them, then you have to be very creative in your achievements. But it's a slippery slope. You just can't go and collapse the whole system. You have to do it in such a manner. If you are a very moralistic person, you have to take into consideration the morals, how important they are to you, and how you can change the system gradually. So I thought that was very important because if you do it, like you said in the first section, if you just come and swing it and you want to change it to your liking, it's not necessarily good because your social institutions do a lot for you. They can help you to make yourself. And if you just denigrate the system, you're not going to get anything from the society. With social system, he basically meant the society. So you have to be very careful. This is the most important part that I thought was in the first chapter, that you have to be very careful with something that serves you, something that builds you. You just can't come and demoralize it. So that's my take.
Very fair. And because it is you, right? Sarika? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Hi, it's Sarika.
Sarika.
Yeah, the A gets pronounced differently in like every culture. So I even trying to figure it out. So my takeaway from this was the balance between, and maybe I can just read this one, like 2 sentences. So to manage complex affairs properly, it's necessary to be cold enough in vision to separate the power-hungry and self-serving pseudo-advocate of the status quo from the genuine conservative, and the self-deceptive, irresponsible rebel without a cause from the truly creative. And to manage this means to separate those factors within the confines of one's own soul as well as among other people. So what I saw with that is that the social institutions and the status quo, many people rise up in that because they may be power hungry and maybe even, you know, take advantage of certain methods of rising in the hierarchy. They may not necessarily be good at what they do, whereas other people might gain genuine authority if they, you know, they do their job well, and they become like the waiter became an indispensable part of the restaurant because no one else could do what he was doing so well. It wasn't just like a political talking head type power figure. It was, you know, a real kind of action-oriented person. And also another part of that is how he defined sanity as knowing the rules of the social game, internalizing them, and then following them. And in some cases, you know, the perfectly sane then, I think, is complicated. It's like, are they power hungry people who just know this game, some version of the game so well, or what? Then for like creativity, creative transformation is, kind of quoting, is integrally dependent on the restrictions of the social institutions, and it has to strain against those limits and, you know, the possibility, potential, and it requires extreme constraint, because new ideas, like although these social institutions exist and they've worked for a long time, we still have new ideas that emerge that incorporate like the priors of the changing environment of the world, for example, and we incorporate these new ideas and we have creative solutions to the future, but we still, the creative transformation has to come up against breaking some rules. And that's a like difficult. And I hope I'm not straying too far, but I did like the example that he gave of the photographer, just a value of creativity, not speaking to it in a way of, because he didn't really give an example of how are we going to use technology to change the world. He gave a great example though of like a photographer and who he was a clinical therapist for, and how over the course of time, he had an increased ability to perceive what was elegant, beautiful, and socially valuable. And so by developing his creative acumen, he had a transformation of his interior processes, that kind of what Jyoti was saying, like it's unfortunate when some people might not have been socialized when they're younger, or get kind of trapped in these like situations where you don't have friends, or you can't make friends, or blah, 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 blah. But through artistic endeavors, you can still have a transformation of interior processes. I thought that was interesting. And that's some of my key takeaways.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And John Engel.
Yes, hello everyone. I think the part of the chapter that spoke to me the most was near the very end, where he has a paragraph right after talking about the story of Jesus, a couple stories of Jesus, where he even says explicitly, you know, this sums up the meaning of Rule 1 perfectly. And it talks about the fact that Jesus, you know, as a very young child, became very adept in the studies, you know, the religious studies of his time, and he came to know them very well. And he came to know and understand the rules and the structure of the institution very well, but then having that understanding, he chose through superior character and through a recognition that some rules are meant to be broken. He allowed himself that flexibility to then, only resting upon the firm understanding of the rules, to start bending the rules and to start breaking some rules. And I love the quote that he gives the person who is breaking Sabbath, something along the lines of, if you know what you're doing, you are blessed. But if you don't know what you're doing, you're basically not blessed at all, the opposite of blessed. And I think that's really interesting. Just thinking about my own life, I'm going into academia in some sense, and I've got a lot of problems with the state of academia and like with the state of some of the disciplines that I'm going into. But I'm very much a beginner, and so I really like that. It kind of made me realize that I need to humble myself tremendously before I start taking aim at any of these problems that I see at an institution where I do value. Kyla Ren, I just saw in the chat. I get that a lot. That's funny. Thank you, Deepak. But yeah, that about wraps up what I have to say.
Thank you, John. I love that section too. And next up is going to be Shelley, then Maritza.
Hey, thanks so much. I am really excited to talk about this book. So the first chapter, here's what I got. I got a ton of stuff. I could talk, quite extensively. However, what I really loved is I've been following Peterson for a long time. I have 5 boys. My number 2 son turned me on to him by listening to that interview where he was attacked by that British lady. Do y'all remember that? And I was just enthralled. I think I've listened to it like 3 times. And I was so impressed with him because of his demeanor, and he was able to maintain his composure and yet address someone who was so violently attacking him. So that's kind of my foundation. I've listened to hundreds of hours of Peterson on YouTube and podcasts and everything. And so one of the things that's bothered me, because one, I think that what Peterson says aligns with how I've tried to live my life and raise my boys. And it's the first time I've ever heard in a public arena where someone talk about the things that I have been saying to my kids. Like, I am not so interested with your happiness as I am purpose. Like, that's just an example for a lot of different things. So it's bothered me that people have denigrated Peterson and kind of thrown him into this conservative camp and kind of made him this polarized figure, when really, if you know him, he is not really polarized. He is not some radical extremist if you've listened to him comprehensively. This first chapter, I think, lays that out really well for someone, right? I loved the idea of, I loved him expressing this balance, right? He's talking about both being this conservative, having hierarchies, how important they are. He revisits that again, but also the importance of creativity and the other side, and how marrying them together is so important. And I felt like it represented him well and accurately. And I was glad to see him do that, because I wondered if in some way he didn't do that to address this. He's not blind to the fact that he's this polarizing figure, that people throw him into this kind of right camp, so to speak. So I wondered if he did that purposely, just to start the whole book off saying, here's where I really stand, before he gets into the rest of the book. Also, who was it that just spoke? The young man that just spoke, that he was talking about the beginner's mindset. I really love that too. And one of my takeaways was, in some ways, we're always in a beginner's mindset, right? We never have all knowledge, and we need to remain understanding that in this, I have something to learn, right? I don't know everything. I may know a lot about some things, but I don't know all things about everything, and remaining really humble and staying in that beginner's mindset. I mean, I'm 52 years old. I've been raising 5 kids. I've got 1 kid at home. I've lived a life. There are things that I know and I know well, but there's a lot of things I don't know well. And I'm excited to learn. I'm excited to learn in this book. Thanks for letting me share, Roger.
Oh, thank you. And next up is going to be Maritza and then Jade.
I really enjoyed this first chapter. I can almost see in the writing his growth between this book and the previous one. There's so much to unpack in this one chapter. I was saying to the moderators earlier that I just feel like so many sections could be their own discussion group. What I see as the central theme here, what ties so many of these little gems that he gives us, is this call for moderation and balance. That really speaks to me as someone who, is often trying to find, that where's that line to walk. And I am firmly in the belief that so many of the problems that the world faces in general is that we either overindulge or not indulge enough. And what I'm hearing in this chapter that Peterson is saying to us, exactly this, go forth, break some rules, but don't break them indiscriminately. So this is very consistent with many of the things he's told us before. You need to move through life with purpose and deliberation. Rules are there for a reason, but it is so vital for us to understand the reason. Blind faith in anything is a sure path towards destruction. That is true of us as individuals. That is true of us as a society. And what Peterson is telling us here in this book is that we need to constantly be doing self-checks, either of ourselves or of our society, in so much that we ensure that those walls that are there to keep you safe are A, still doing their job, and B, not confining you. And I really appreciate that he emphasizes both. You need some walls in your life, but they should be barriers that help you. They should not be cages that enclose you. And if you see a wall and you don't immediately know which type of wall it is, you really do need to stop and reassess. And if we don't do that continually in our lives, we are going to find ourselves stunted, and there's going to be a lesser opportunity for us to improve ourselves mentally, physically, socially, and morally. I really find that he addresses all 4 of these aspects in each one of, in all the various sections of this book. He tells us that, and it's kind of like Shelley said, Shelley said, oh, don't be focused on happiness, focus on these other things. And I really do. That's a Stoic concept that I agree with. If you are living your life virtuously, happiness is going to be a byproduct that will just happen. And really, Peterson is kind of saying, if you are constantly looking at the ebb and flow of the patterns in your life, whether they're, which side are they on? Are they overly restrictive? Are they not restrictive enough? Are you finding yourself standing still? Movement is what ensures you're alive, right? Surviving is not living. So we need to ensure that we're moving, constant movement. And Peterson says, creativity, trying things. Like I love the, I want to say parable because that's what comes to mind. But the tale he was telling us about the photographer. it gives hope, you know, for those of us who are, you know, maybe in our fourth or more decade of life. We may look at ourselves sometimes and go, stop that, self, you're a little old for that. But I mean, maybe that's not true. Maybe that's the path to staying, you know, I don't want to say young, but I'm going to use young. You know, the creativity has so many shapes and sizes, and it's a matter of, it's just another way to break out of that comfort zone and build new walls, or maybe creativity is the door that will get you out of a wall that you find to be confining. And if that's not hopeful, I don't know what is. So this, I find this to be an extremely upbeat chapter, and I'm looking forward to the rest. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Maritza. And next up is Jade.
You're muted, Jade.
Sorry about that. When going through this chapter, there's a lot that comes out, but I feel as though the overlying principle throughout this, or the thing that Peterson is basically trying to do, is outline the power struggle or relationship between the traditional and the non-traditional. And basically he's doing that by trying to outline how not to be an asshole, because that's what power struggles do. They make everybody into an asshole because nobody's thinking of anybody else. So there are a few phrases that come to mind. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And that's less about conformity and more about respect. You go into a traditional environment, you don't go in there swinging, you don't go in there the exact opposite unless you're trying to cause trouble. It's a question of respect. And if you are, in essence, authentically the exact opposite, you figure out, well, what version of my authentic self does actually fit in here? What aspects of myself can I genuinely bring here? And then the other one is that thing that I think he's trying to explain to everyone is you need to figure out how to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because that's something that always happens with people who want to be progressive. You throw out all the old stuff, like it doesn't matter anymore, and it usually does still matter. But sometimes systems and things are not perfect. So you know what? There could be room for improvement. So it's in essence, again, I think he's advocating for the ability to know how to throw out the bathwater without throwing out the baby, or determining what in there needs to be saved, what needs, have a sieve where you can figure out what has value and what doesn't, and what is missing. Then I also feel as though within the don't be an asshole part, okay, before that, I'll say that, no, I'll go with this first. It's the concept, and I'm talking a lot about the people who are making change in what I'm saying. I'm framing it that way. And I'll explain that why in a second. But it's, don't make the whole world change if you are really going to be the only one who's going to benefit from that change. Again, very selfish. And then two, which is the opposite side for the people who are more traditional and conservative, don't refuse to change if the ways you insist things should go are not beneficial to even you, because that's often sometimes the case. What you're sitting on and refuse to change isn't benefiting you or those around you. So even if it is benefiting you, are you capable of thinking about how this, whatever this is that you don't want to change, is damaging those around you? Now, this is where people may or may not agree with me. You might not have agreed with anything I said. That's fine too. But the reality is, most of the time, the burden of proof lies on the person who's asking for the change. So if you are the non-traditional person and you are seeking to, I'm almost done, and you are seeking to get people to go, it's kind of like people are going to sit there and they're going to look at you like, why should I leave my stability for you? Because you say so? That's not going to be enough for people. It's more, to me, it seems as though if you're asking people to deviate from what they're actually doing, you kind of need to figure out how it is that you're actually going to get them to go with you. Because you have to get them to bring them with you, because you're moving from this stable, consistent point. You got to figure out, how am I going to get them to go with you? What is appealing for them? Because why have someone give up everything that makes them comfortable to make you comfortable? Unless you're in a romantic relationship, and most of us probably know even in a romantic relationship, people don't do that. So it's yeah. So basically, the last 3 points is, well, I'm going to use the dragon, and I think I was kind of talking to Maritza about this another day. Is sometimes you need to be willing to slay the dragon on your own. If you are going to be that non-traditional, you have to begin that quest on your own. And that is going to be a lonely, isolated journey, but you got to make sure that you have enough, whatever it is that you need to do it. And then if you don't do it, you need to find a cave and hide out until you find a nice passerby who's willing to help you. And then if that doesn't work, you go to the local, town, since we're in dragons, the local, I don't know, it's not a town back then, I can't think of what it's called, local kingdom, and you find people who will join you on your quest. But you don't strong arm people into doing that, because as he said, or better yet, as my elementary through middle school principal would say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's it.
Thank you, Jade. And again, folks, for anyone who would like to add their thoughts, please just type exclamation point. Otherwise, we'll be moving on to the next section. But next up was going to be Judith.
Hi. Wow, I'm so afraid now, but I can do this. I had a different response reading the chapter, actually. And I just want to preface a couple things. I didn't know Jordan Peterson before. I don't come with some whatever baggage some people are alluding to, but I was through most of the maps of meaning, and I highly respect him. So that's a given there. Also, I highly respect, what my social systems have done for me in my life. So don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have food on my table. None of us would if we didn't have a social system structure that we lived within. However, I just feel that most of us come with the idea, most of us without realizing it, fall into our social structures and accept them without questioning them. So I was a little surprised that he started that way, like as a foundation, especially with his examples of young people, trying to find their world. Because I mean, as a mother of 2 children, when they were growing up quite a long time ago, but well, probably also because I was in a culturally mixed marriage, and they were growing up in a very homogenous, small, little white universe here. There were so many religious and social constructs around them that one of the first things I taught them is that every family is different. There are different towns everywhere. Cities look different. Countries look different. There are all these different social institutions. They operate in different ways. None is ideal. So, I mean, every place has its flaws. So what you want to do really is see what, just look at it that way. Like, what do I have? What does this social structure give me within my family? And the other thing is, there's only one way really any person can be. Every time you take an action, you decided to come to this meetup tonight, you've made a choice and you've eliminated all other possible actions. So I kind of think of the world that way too. Like there aren't infinitely many ways. There isn't going to be any perfect way ever, So that's something that I wanted my kids to think about too. But before, I wanted them to be socialized, and those social structures exist within peers too. You know, right away, peers develop a structure that they live within. Doesn't mean that you can't have friends. It just means that you have to be able to, you know, that if you're looking from the outside, I'm saying, doesn't mean you don't have friends if you're looking from the outside. It just means that you have to be, or that you should be, let's say, that you should be critically looking at what are the structures that you live within? What are you accepting just the way it is? And, you know, what do you wish to compromise or not compromise to live within that? And what are your ideals and how do you decide? And they don't have to be, and I told my kids, you know, they don't have to be my ideals. That's your world to figure out as a unique individual. As you grow, and I make rules or whatever, and they're for this reason, you know, to protect you, yes, you know. But it's young people who break those rules, and sometimes they do. And sometimes I think like Greta Thunberg is you know, an environmentalist. He was describing an environmentalist. When I grew up 30 plus years ago, they were talking about the environment. Nobody did anything. No, we didn't do anything about it, just, so to speak. So sometimes you need those people that are out there. And she said, you know, you could compare her to Harry Potter or whatever he, you know, in the book like he did, but I wasn't really satisfied with that. But yeah, so she broke the rules. She didn't go to school, you know, and took a sailboat to make a statement to come across the ocean. But, you know, she did things for a higher purpose. So I guess we're all going to give her leeway, and I am too, you know, that's good. But what about the people that follow her, right? Some of them are just sheep following her. Is that bad? No, that's how things change. You know, sometimes very few leaders out there, but sometimes people will just follow without fully comprehending why they are. That girl who he talked to, who was an angry environmentalist, who wasn't really going to do anything. But we need those people for agents of change too sometimes, you know. It's just really complicated, is all I'm saying. And I think I was just surprised that the thing that I think is easiest, the thing that I think that we most likely are to fall into, which is believe our social systems, is the thing he started with saying, well, don't forget, you have to do that. No, I know he showed both sides, but the emphasis was like on balance rather than on, there just seemed to be more focus on, you know, praising them and acknowledging what they do than the harder part, which is, to me, which is finding like, where do you fit within that, and what are the blind spots that I have about that because I am conditioned by my family and my little culture here, things like that. So I assume that he will go into that in the rest of the book. So I guess that I'm just complaining that that's how he started and I wasn't satisfied with it.
Yeah, more than fair. Brian.
So when I read this chapter, first of all, I really liked it. It was addressing a question that, an important, well, to me, a fundamental question that I was carrying in from the last book, which is exactly this of how do you balance or how do you decide to properly respect institutions and creativity, to use the way he framed it. You know, is there something wrong with me? Is there something, the other way to frame it is, if there's a disconnect, is it something wrong with me or something wrong with the world? In that cocktail story that I thought was so good. When I read the photographer's story in this chapter, it occurred to me that a solution to this question that I've been carrying is in the concept of virtuosity. So that rules could be seen as something that you learn as an apprentice and then you master them. Let's say like an adult or a teacher, and then you can you go beyond them, coming up with new rules as a virtuoso. So rules to me might be in this way analogous to language or music. You develop not just the power that people here have focused on, but the competence also, which Jordan Peterson refers to. So, and then the competence can lead to authority, which is that this chapter goes off on, I think, more on that side than, that's its focus, how the competence leads to authority. But I think virtuosity is to me, a concept that really helped me decide once I've mastered, I need to, if you will, I need to master the medium, I need to master the rules. I need to be doing what's appropriate in the circumstance before I can take a lead and suggest creative change. Now, how do I know that I'm really a virtuoso? It's feedback that I have to say, it's probably feedback I get from other people. I mean, I'm not talking about me personally, but if the virtuoso is the person who gets feedback, positive feedback in a new way. So like Beethoven is, to me, the one that always pops to mind. He really, he conquered the piano. He conquered the symphony composition in the old style very early in life, and then branched out in a very creative way. So to me, and then I took that idea, this one of apprentice, master, and virtuosity, and I've tried to apply it to the other parts of this chapter. And at least for me, things started making sense that way. So that, to me, that was a concept that was very helpful. Although I have to say that this is a very sweeping chapter that talks about all the arenas of life. It even touches on the biological, as some people have said, but personal, family, and all the rest. So you really need to sort out how that might apply, how this concept might apply in those different arenas.
All right, thank you, Brian. And
Can I talk a minute?
oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm here with Brian. I'm his wife, Penny. Anyway, I'm going to be simpler. I didn't quite make it through the chapter. I think I have to start a little earlier because part of it was more like reading a textbook more than a novel. So, but what I thought, to me, struck me the most was when they said like the necessity of balance and between conservatism and originality, and then that they're interdependent. And I was really struck by the theme. I thought on both sides, like that people have, on both sides, whether you're conservative or original, you have to be open and you have to be respectful. Because, there are good things about the conservatives who want to maintain the structure, but of course, there are also great things about the people who want to be creative. And if both people are open and respectful, then you can proceed without like throwing the baby out with the bathwater or something. I mean, because both people maybe can give a little bit. The creative person can maybe see that certain things should be left. And the conservative person can concede that, yes, things could improve, things could be better. So anyway, that was what I thought was interesting and struck me most.
Oh, thank you for sharing. And next is going to be Becky.
I'm going to talk a bit about hierarchies, and Claire had first brought it up, and that was also the same thing that went through my mind. So it's like, oh, the lobsters, also very appropriate for rule 1. So hierarchies emerge from biological and social needs of people. The internal hierarchy is finding the appropriate balance of emotional and motivational drives that's most suitable for the individual's situation at hand in order to operate within society. Then the external or social hierarchy is a result of cooperative and competitive interactions where respect and authority are voluntarily given to those with more competent skills necessary for preservation and growth of society as a whole. And people who object to hierarchies often confuse power and authority. And in the book, I'll read a quote. If there is a problem to be solved, and many people involve themselves in the solution, then a hierarchy must and will arise, as those who can do and those who cannot follow as best they can, often learning to be competent in the process. If the problem is real, then people who are best at solving the problem at hand should rise to the top. This is not power, it is an authority that properly accompanies ability. And then the second confusion is then with power and ambition. Now, there's nothing wrong with ambition, because there's nothing wrong with trying to become more competent. And so with ambition, but good people are ambitious and diligent, honest, focused along with it. Instead, because they are possessed by the desire to solve genuine, serious problems. That variant of ambition needs to be encouraged in every possible manner. It is for this reason, among many others, that the increasing reflexive identification of the striving of boys and men for victory from the patriarchal tyranny that hypothetically characterizes our modern productive and comparatively free societies is so stunningly counterproductive. And it must be said, cruel. There is almost nothing worse than treating someone striving for a victory as a tyrant in training.
All right, thank you, Vic. Thank you, Becky. And Laura is next.
Okay. I didn't read the book, but I'm listening to everything everybody said, and I feel like you're telling me about my life. As a little kid, I didn't have a friend.
Laura, can we do one thing? We will do that during takeaways.
Okay,
right
sorry.
now, we are just talking about what people got from the book.
Okay. Well, this is what I'm getting.
You'll
from
be
the
able to
book.
get that. That's exactly what takeaways are for. What did you get from all the discussion? You will get more in the breakout rooms. And
I'll
then
take it later. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
All right, and next is going to be Andrew.
Yes, hello. So I thought I'm actually listening to the book, which I think it provides a little bit different angle, because you actually get to hear what he emphasizes, right, and kind of hear his tone. And whereas I think when you read it, I mean, of course, there's value in reading it too, but you might kind of read it the way you want to read it, so to speak. There's some confirmation bias potential there. But anyway, that aside, I think he says he goes over much of what he said before, which is perfectly reasonable, right? I mean, these are the many years of study and elaboration. And again, I've said this before, but his philosophy is, from what I can tell, he's just a Darwinian to the core, and all of these, basically what he's describing, the value of respecting social structures and everything like that, that's all based on the need for this balance. And I think one thing I kind of thought about this, and I heard this, and I think this is where he gets criticized. He sounds sometimes, and even in this book, like he has some contempt. It sounds like he has some contempt for people that are too far to the left, who are breaking the rules without knowing that they should not be doing that just for breaking the rules' sake. And I thought about that, and it's like, what I'm actually reading into it now is that he's saying that essentially, and he said this before, the creative people, right, basically those people more on the left, have a greater responsibility than anyone else, because they are the ones, the catalyst for change. And his kind of, what at times sounds kind of venomous to me, it's like, it's really, well, and he's one of those people. He's a creative left guy also, actually. So what I hear in his voice now is that it's not so much a contempt for the left. It's more like, the analogy I have is, he's like a parent, who, you have a kid who's kind of misbehaving and screwing around, and you kind of get angry at your kid, not because they're disobeying the rules, but you're kind of like, get your shit together you're not being as good as you can be. And I think that's where he's coming from. So he has he has a lot invested in creative people, and he's saying, like, listen, you are the ones that we are depending on to make things better. So do your studying and recognize. So it's actually what he's really trying to say, like, guys, you know, the creative types, you got to get your stuff together because we're relying on you. And with like a lot of interesting angles there, like, for example, like there are a couple of reasons to respect the structure. One is because it's basically a manifestation of evolution, and you just have to respect that because that's why we're here to even talk about this. He mentions that you have to respect it because those systems that you're trying to fight against, like someone said, those are the systems that are making things relatively safe and peaceful. And obviously basically what I saw this, he's talking basically his audience is affluent democracies for the most part, which is fine because there's plenty of people there. But anyway, he's saying that, you know, respect it because it's those systems that gives you the safety to even complain about this stuff to begin with. So that's a good reason to respect it. And then another reason to respect it is that the rules that are in place now were actually at some point in the past new rules that came about because people want to change. So he's got a big theme on respect, which I think is interesting. And it's the respect that comes. It's not kind of like this ephemeral, you know, out of the ether, like respect is important. It all comes down from, basically, it's like respect the fact that we've evolved. It's really interesting. It's like, it's respect out of evolution. It's a very interesting. That's it.
Yeah, I actually really like that whole idea of the emergence of an ethic from evolution. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Roger and Shrikant. The one thing I don't think's been mentioned yet was the wrestling match between the rats. To me, was so important. In the first book, we start off with the lobsters and the dominance hierarchy. You know, the strongest survive, the strongest in charge, and of course, the strongest gets the choice of mates, all this wonderful stuff. But then talking about the experiment with the rats, you know, a little slightly larger rat, you know, smaller rat. And of course, they love to wrestle. So they get in the cage and they wrestle. Of course, the big one wins. But the observation after several times that if the big one, the larger rat doesn't let the smaller rat win part of the time, the smaller will quit wrestling, and you know they both don't get to have any fun. So it sounds like, you know, we have a little firmware built in there that we're actually programmed to play fair. And that was, to me, such a great insight that we're just learning more and more about the brain all the time. Anyway, I enjoyed getting into this book. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. All right. And now we're going to be switching to Shrikant, who's back for setting up for, I think, Victor's next. Yeah.
Victor.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you so much. And so tonight, well, so we are starting with rule number 1. And it's amazing that almost everyone went through the first chapter and amazing takeaways. And maybe this presentation will be a slightly repetitive, but let's see how it goes. And so we are starting with the idea of self-reflection, actually. So with this first rule, the idea is stop, just recalculate yourself, where you are, what you're trying to criticize, what you're trying to put out there. So he starts with that, but at the same time, going forward, he talks about social institutions and creative achievements. If we want to put them into categories, we can say family values, law of the land, financial institutions, educational institutions, and religious institutions as social institutions. And on the creative side, we can say science and tech, which always breaks new ground, and brings in new ideas, art, and new social ideas, new cultures, new way of living. So we can, there is always a rift between these two, these two ideas. And going forward, this chapter, he builds the chapter itself in a very good way. He starts off with the idea of loneliness and confusion, and he gives an example of one of his clients and establishes the idea of going out and doing something. And then how the social institution itself acts as a sanity place. And then as an individual, what is it that we try to achieve, try to act in the world? That's the idea of the point of pointing. And then when we go out and act, where do we start? That's the idea of the fool, the equal, and the top dog. And then how the social institutions are necessary, but at the same time insufficient, and how to draw the balance. So, and then he concludes, how do you act? How do you bring the balance? And he opens the idea of loneliness and confusion with his own client, his own experience with the client, where the client himself is not in a great position socially. So he lives by himself. He doesn't have too many family ties. And he says when he first met him, he couldn't even talk. The client barely opens himself up. And he was kind of abrupt. There were no social skills. There is no conversation dynamic. But over time, as he comes in, as he keeps on coming to the sessions, he talks about himself for like 50 minutes most of the time. And as he does that, he could see, well, with all the help from the therapist himself, he sees the change in his life where he cultivates friends and he picks up his hobby, plays the guitar again, and builds the social skills. And he even goes to the point where he reads poetry to people. And the reason he gives this example is to tell us that talking out and talking to another person is important to either remember or to forget our own past. That helps as a therapy itself. And words, most of the times when we are just thinking, they don't clarify. Words, thinking out your thoughts, either writing it out or talking to someone, actually helps to heal themselves. And so we actually talk and listen ourselves talk, and that's how we clarify our thoughts and then go act. And then he brings in the idea of social institutions, and great psychologists Freud and Jung always their own point. The central idea is sanity is a characteristic of individual mind. What does it mean? It means we are subpersonalities. We are a collection of subpersonalities. We all have our own insecurities, our own trivial things that we are worried about, that we are too comfortable about. And Freud and Jung. So Freud's idea of id, ego, and superego. We are sandwiched between our id, our unconscious, and our superconscious. And we are sandwiched between that, and we always struggle with that. And Jung's idea is the self, and yourself and this shadow. So the things that are repressed and the things that you want to do, we always struggle with that. And the thing is, these are internal ideas. However, as a person, we don't think ourselves out of our problems. We actually have to act. And that's the reason Peterson says whenever he sees a new client, he does a sanity check in different areas in their life, like education. How is their health? What are they doing? How are they doing with their finances? Social life. What are their future plans? Do they have a stable partner? And family relationships, and what are they doing with their time? So all these kinds of things help to assess a person where they are, and then he goes into therapy. So this is all to say we actually outsource our sanity, meaning we don't think and become sane, but we actually depend on the outer circumstances to feel ourselves sane. And he moves into the idea of pointing, and he gives this example of his granddaughter, who, as she was growing up as a toddler, she points at things that she finds interesting, which is a good way to see how our brain develops to the value, the idea of what is value to us, which also, as we grow, we use words as pointers. And as adults, we know that we only act towards value. If I'm hungry, I go grab food. If I'm thirsty, I go grab some water, and similar things. So that is the idea of where we actually have to move. So social institutions and individual. So these two are a dance between themselves. Social institutions, let's say someone who wants to go study law. So they go to an institution, they study the law, and they come out and they become a lawmaker, and then they go in, bring in the new ideas, and they change the law. So it's a dance between those two. So we move towards the value with the institutions and also with the individual. And then he moves into the idea of, okay, now that we know we have to act, how do we act? Where do we start? The idea of start at the bottom. Start at the bottom, so it brings you the gratitude and humility, and the apprenticeship gives the handle on the rules, the existing rules. And then this is the idea of, it's not, the idea of being a fool is not a negative idea. And he gives an example of, in tarot cards, there is always a card called fool, and it is seen in a positive way. And at the same time, he mentions about the person who was working in the restaurant and who was resentful towards his own job. And then he starts watching Peterson's videos, and he makes a change in his life. And the changes reflect themselves as promotions for him. And that's a very good testimonial story. And the idea of necessity of equals. And we see it in our own lives. We actually communicate with our friends, the peers who are at our own level, much more clearly than the ones that are under us or over us in hierarchy. So the idea of equality and to be an equal is important. And if things permit, we can become the best of what we are doing and become the best of it. And we can take new responsibility. And here Peterson mentions, it's not the power that you should be going for, it's the authority of whatever you're doing, because power always corrupts. And he goes really deep into that idea. And the insufficiency of social institutions. The idea of social institutions is, so we made a thing into a system and we follow that. Well, the social institutions, they take us to one level and then we cannot move forward, and it's not complete. Because any social state, any social institution, the rules are made from the past, and they might be good for present, but they might not be good for future. But what kind of choice we have at this point? Do we conform to the existing rules, or do we go break them? And then the idea of balance comes in, and the personality and the capacity to transform yourself or transform the things that are outside. And for this, he gives 3 examples, and one is from Jesus of Nazareth. He actually first masters the existing culture, and only then goes and questions the authority. And same thing with the idea of Harry Potter, and where Harry, Hermione, and Ron, they follow the rules and they master the rules, and only when they see the rules are not fit for the higher good or for the higher virtue, only then they go and break the rules. And the same thing with Disney's Pocahontas. The idea is, well, her father asks her to marry someone who is very rule bound, but she goes out and falls in love with someone outside of her culture. And that's the idea of stepping outside. That's how he gives, well, basically he brings everything together to these two things. Follow the rules to become a shining exemplar. So master the rules and only break the rules when they become impediment to central virtues. And that's the first rule. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And Shrikant, you want to?
Yeah, Victor, you always outdo yourself with these slides. Just love them. And that was a great way of kind of reminding everybody of the structure of the the chapter. And folks, what Victor will be doing every time would be, his general assignment is to come up with a myth that captures the chapter, but he will do many things. He's very creative, so whatever he does is beautiful. So wonderful. So next up is going to be Roger talking about how do you map this rule in maps of meaning. How do you do it, Roger?
So I didn't have time to make a slideshow this week, but I will be pointing to a couple of the previous presentations that me, Victor, and Claire have done, and just kind of pointing out how they relate to this book. I did it by section, so I'll just quickly point out some of the things that you may have sounded familiar as you were reading it. The first is in Loneliness and Confusion. It's the first section. When he's talking about outsourcing your sanity, right? The idea that your culture is what defines you, and more importantly, that what defines you is therefore defined by the collective, by the group. This kind of falls into that order concept, and more importantly, the benevolent or tyrannical king. Essentially, you are the product of your culture, and to critique it is to critique not just the very thing that made you, but the thing that shaped you. So there's a part of you that you carry from your own culture. So anytime you critique your culture, you are in essence also critiquing yourself, because it is this very thing that shaped you. There's also, as Victor already mentioned, the idea of subpersonalities, and Peterson mentions that in the next section, which we had also discussed at length, of this idea that internal you isn't just broken up into drives or things that you desire, but rather fully shaped personalities with their own motivations, their own worldviews, their own ideas of what they want and how they're going to get it. And it's just like, it's not as well rounded. It's more of a one-dimensional character within you that's driving a certain drive. That's kind of the idea of the gods at war and the Greek myths that we've talked about before. And more importantly, how, for Peterson's sake, especially for this chapter, how he's talking about all of them submitting to a higher order, which goes down to what eventually he kind of says, even the rules themselves, why the reason it's okay to break the rules is because the rules aren't the end all be all, right? They're not the thing that's supposed to happen, but rather they're not the thing that should be followed for the sake of being followed, but rather because they point to something higher. And that something higher is this higher order of how you organize even yourself. As well as the point of pointing, where he talks about iterable games, as Dave already pointed out, he talks about the large and small rat and the idea of reciprocity as a naturally emerging ethic. When the reason this is really important is because it's essentially the idea of our ethics, of the things of how you should live, coming out of almost a game theory evolutionary perspective, where in order to play a game, you have to play a game that everyone wants to play and that at least doesn't get worse through time. Otherwise, the game will just stop being played. But what that requires is an ethic. It requires that you play fairly. It requires that you play in a way that everyone else also enjoys. And what that means is it's not just that you want to be good, but that there's a part of us that's programmed, or I like Dave's example of firmware, that essentially is pushing you to be good. It's that sensation of fairness that you naturally have. A couple of other things that I noted that were very much from Maps of Meaning was the idea that our ethics is partly socialized and it's aiming at an equilibrated state, the Piaget game, but that those are the variety that you see is at a social level. However, at a biological level, there's some universal meta rules that are followed. So in other words, for Peterson, one of his main interests is making the case for why morals are more biological than philosophically. Normally you would talk more about a philosophical concept of morality. And that's where he gets into bottom up, which I would say the entire section is a shortened version of maps of meaning. Essentially, it's essentially the concept of how at a very small level the human can be broken down to a deterministic machine, but the more complex the system you get, the more abstract it gets. So you at first you may have, and that's why he has a little bit of stimulus A gets response A, but then even just a slight modification can vary that response. And then you can get so varied in that response that you start to create drives. And then from those drives start to get, there's a bunch of different drives. So they have to start getting mediated by emotions. And then those emotions have to start to get mediated by cognitive systems. And that's where our consciousness starts to emerge. It's kind of the thing that's managing, the thing that's managing, the thing that's managing, the thing that's managing our bottom systems. Sorry, I'm trying to go through this because I already know I do want to get to the breakout rooms, and I feel like we've been going a little bit longer than normal.
All right, that's fine. If you want to wrap up,
yeah.
Come to wrap up.
There's just one last one, and it would just be at the very end, the idea of the personality and what personality should we hold, and that's basically Peterson's core idea of what stories are. Is that stories essentially capture a way of being, a personality profile, essentially. And religions capture the ideal personality profile. But in doing that, the hero normally, what he points out is if you see these institutions and the struggle that the hero has to both live within order, but then constantly be challenging order, the dynamic that he points out is that the hero follows order until it stops serving that greater good, that greater idea of something, of the equilibrated state, essentially. But yeah, I just wanted to point out a couple of things that we've already discussed that I hope you guys might have picked up on while reading the book.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger. So folks, it's time for breakout rooms now. We have settled on these two questions for the breakout rooms. The first one is about how do you balance between conservatism that captures everything that is making life possible and creativity, which is a way of engaging life. And how can we tell when we're being too conservative or too creative? So that's the first question. The second question is a more personal question. When have you denigrated a social institution on which you depend? And when do you denigrate creative endeavor on which future depends? All right. And then each of the discussion leaders will have maybe one more question to put in. So there is a lot of flexibility in the for the discussion leader to make sure that the breakout rooms work well. The basic rules in the breakout room: keep on topic, be brief, be courteous, and encourage others to speak. If needed, just click on ask for help and Claire will help you. All right. So Claire, could we start the breakout rooms? And we're going to run for about 22 minutes. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. All right, so it's time for takeaways. So you can talk about takeaways, you can put questions on the table, and we will put all of it together, starting from there. You can go ahead and type exclamation mark in order to share your takeaways or ask questions. Try to be brief so we can get through everybody. And then once we've gone through everybody, then we will go ahead and start putting things together. All right, so it's going to be Jade, Joe, Ron. Jade, go ahead.
So mine is very brief. I think the last statement that I made in the group was more of a question in terms of changing things that need to be changed, and kind of on the power struggle aspect that I put out before. between the traditional, non-traditional, conform, non-conform, we need to fix things, not fix things, things are fine the way they are. And it's, are you seeking to maintain your stance or obtain an objective? And if it's about obtaining an objective, then one, it becomes less personalized, and you're discussing thoughts, not necessarily, you're really just trying to find out what works. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's what is your objective? To be right? And no, I won't go into being right. Is it your stamp or your objective? Because sometimes they're not the same.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be Joe, Ron, Alex, Sarika, and Dave. Joe, go ahead.
So we had a really good breakout room, and we were talking about, the distinction, like when obviously, when we in certain points have denigrated social institutions. And a really good example was where William had changed was the idea of religion, where, he said, at different points in time that he was very much against religion. But he has since come around to understand and appreciate some of the roles that it plays in people's lives. And I think that that's an excellent example of how sometimes we may have an opinion of something based on our belief systems, and yet we'll actually tear down the system without understanding why it's there in the first place and what it actually espouses, and that there's some value to that. So I thought that that was a very important insight to have. I also think that there is this, this particular chapter really does speak to the idea of having one foot in chaos and one foot in order, as he had talked about in the past, because it's when do you actually denigrate an institution or, come up with a creative approach to something new. And I do believe that it requires a certain degree of naivete to do that, because you have to be constantly curious. But I think you have to balance that with also a certain level of respect of why you're trying to change something in the first place. And a lot of people fail to do that. And I think this is true in entrepreneurship many times. And I think you also see this where there's even movements where they're talking about, and I mentioned this in the room, that they feel like they have to break things or tear down an industry in order to recreate it, as opposed to using what exists, current institutions that currently exist, and understand why they exist in the first place. So I think it's a very dangerous concept that actually plays itself out in everyday in economics and in business with venture capitalists. You'll often hear this. And there's the ethical bend, which I won't go too far into, which comes in with with justice and everything. But the other thing I do want to mention is that it's very interesting how Peterson was able to link this working on an individual level and as well as societal level. And I think that that's a really important point, because if your philosophy is solid, that it worked when he was in counseling and how he approached counseling and how he approached people with depression, but the same philosophical approach scales when he was talking about how we function and denigrate social institutions as well. And that's the sign of somebody that's really thought this process out. I thought it was a very interesting chapter and a very interesting discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Ron, Alex, and Sarika. Ron.
Yeah, just to keep it short, I really like Peterson's one-liner as a takeaway, which the idea is to have progress and peace at the same time. It's a really good one-liner. And even though he meant it socially, I like the idea of it as an interior personal thing too, the idea of personal growth while maintaining inner peace. So that's kind of one takeaway for me.
Wow. Ron, that was fantastic. That's beautiful. I've not thought of that at a personal level. Beautiful. Next up is Alex, Sarika, and Dave. Alex.
With regards to question one, how to balance conservatism with creativity, the question was raised, like about bias, about inherent biases. And while I'm not a psychologist, I've seen enough of the literature to become a huge cynic on this issue. I think that the general population, including myself, has such a high degree of bias that, in fact, when you look at the studies on political ideology, it's just astounding how much bias there is, and how much we sort of will automatically divide within our tribes. I don't want to be, even though I'm a hardcore pessimist on this, a positive finding I have seen within the literature is that one way to, I guess, be constructive about it is, this might be self-explanatory, but to keep questioning, to keep raising questions and dig, like when it's issues or topics that you're interested in, dig beneath the surface and keep questioning until you have this sort of mastery of a topic or of a subject. And I think that's what Peterson mentioned in his first chapter, but again, I have to be humble here because I haven't read his first chapter. So that's it, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Alex. Most of us here are largely optimist, and it's very interesting that what you boil down to of asking questions is, I think, something that both optimists certainly agree on that, on questions. So it's very interesting that you talked about that. Thank you, Alex. Next up is Sarika, Dave, and Kevin. Sarika.
Hi, so it occurred to me at like the end of the breakout session, but turning to the section of the book on personality as hierarchy, and he asks, how do we balance the social institutions and creative transformation? And he said it's not easy, and so we turn to stories, and how stories are written and the main character sort of personifies how someone within the confines of the world at hand kind of succeeds. And so we have religious texts, and historically religious texts have given us guidance as to how to behave and how the hero character would behave. And then he had the example of the daughter and how she had two dolls, a baby doll, and then she had a Pocahontas doll. So the baby doll, she saw herself as the mother, but the Pocahontas doll, she mimicked the movie that she saw, and she saw herself as like, I am Pocahontas, I'm not getting married, and I'm gonna conquer the world and be like the heroine. And she had that narrative, that very powerful narrative that doesn't really exist in other stories, because this story existed. And stories are so important, like science fiction movies over the last 50 years have given us so many examples of how like technology, problems of machines and consciousness and government, like Battlestar Galactica, these stories are really important. And I think as people grapple with the confines and limitations of social institutions, writing more stories about how we would want to see the world unfold might be a good way to explore that realm, and also give people positive examples of putting the representation on the screen of the best possible outcome within a story or a movie or something. So that was my takeaway.
Thank you, Sarika. I like the point about stories as being kind of the integrators, and like people have used that for a long time. So that's huge. Next up is Dave, Kevin, and Becky. Dave.
I'm going to start out with a commercial. This is the book, and I heard people saying, I think that they're having trouble. There's this new institution called a bookstore, and I'm a little personally opposed to Amazon taking over the whole world. So just you might consider that. Got it, Barnes and Noble, may pay a little bit more, but I recommend that. But to the discussion, we had a nice discussion in our small breakout room, and we didn't come to blows, but we were talking about our differences. And I think there is something to be said for it. We're in our own bubbles. Because I remember in the first book, Jordan Peterson was saying about there's no such thing as a patriarchy, because after all, a man invented the birth control pill. So I remember from the split brain meetup we had a week or so ago, that there's a part of the brain that can justify any mistake. And I think we do a lot of that. But I think talking to each other, in fact, it goes into what Victor was talking about, the Carl Rogers, the unconditional personal regard. Just the conversation can be very healing. And I think talking to each other may help us break or bridge these differences a little bit. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone.
Wonderful, Dave. Thank you. Again, the point of bubble and biases is the same point that Alex was bringing up, that's a huge thing. And I think talking to each other in an authentic way is a very powerful corrective mechanism. Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Becky, and Maritza. Kevin.
Thank you, everyone. In the breakout room, Victor mentioned use 10 years as a span. That's great. Then if 10 years ago, my story, my experience would be different today. I believe next 10 years would be change again. Every time my mindset try to experience different perspective, either from left to right, conservative to liberal. My story it's just each side seems to all make sense. Then I got a hard time to accept ambiguity or controversial story. Maybe that's by nature. So I would say when we read this book, it's great. At a certain time, makes sense. The rules make it on the past. It try apply it today. It's done work for tomorrow. So the time, space, and culture matters. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. I have a comment about the time part, which I'll talk about when my turn comes. Next up is Becky, followed by Maritza. Becky. Folks, if you want to share your takeaways, go ahead and type ! Becky.
You have something to say?
So Peterson says that there are unlimited problems with hypothetically unlimited potential solutions, but there are a comparatively limited number of solutions that work practically. So what we have in terms of conservative techniques or systems, that came from things being tested, the tried and true methods over time. Our past has dictated to us what has survived, and that's why we value that. But when we see that the present no longer matches the past, that's when it's appropriate to inject change and creativity. And rarely is it the case that our present is so different from the past, unless we've been willfully blind for a very long time. In that case, we really need to make a radical change. But oftentimes it's gradual. So the injection of creativity should really come carefully. But also when you put in something new into the system, you don't always know what is involved, what new things are introduced that can create problems. So do it carefully. So that's all.
Wonderful. Great observations as always. Thanks, Becky. Next up is Maritza, followed by Jyoti. Maritza?
So as some of you may have heard me say before, I really do love this concept of the call to embrace your culture as fiercely as you embrace your individuality. I really just do love that. And I can see that again here in this first chapter of Peterson's. And so what I wrote down here is walls, right? And it seems so simple concept, but walls can be a shelter or they can be a prison. We can, or we should, honor the ancestor who built that wall, but don't honor them so blindly that you fail to see the cracks. Take the initiative and patch those cracks. Maybe look to your neighbor for help or for ideas. and consider the possibility that the wall requires a full makeover. Maybe there's just a matter of it needing a door. And this is, Peterson calls us, and I love this. He said, we, the visionary living. And I think that's so powerful and so beautiful. So we should have the vision to view all the walls in our lives as a call to respect and transformation in every aspect. Sometimes it's just a matter of changing your perspective. If you are feeling confined, figure out what needs done. If you yourself cannot figure it out, look to your neighbor, because we are stronger sometimes in the masses than we are in the single. But sometimes if the masses are not coming up with a solution, you may have to forge ahead alone and hope that you don't fall on your face. But the awesome thing is, if you do fall on your face, you just get up and try again. Thank you.
Yes, I've watched 1-year-old learn to walk. They do exactly that. Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah. Peterson is really very, very wise. He ends by saying, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. He's so very right in saying that. I noticed that people who come from different countries, when they first come here, they don't know the system well. They don't know on what basis the system has been established. So they have a tendency to criticize and become very creative in changing the policies or system or what have you, or they talk about it at least. They don't understand that they're comparing apples with oranges. They're not comparing apples with apples. As a result, they become very frustrated. And after living in the country for a while, then they realize, they sit back and say, oh, I see why the system is like this. Because what I saw in my country doesn't work here. As simple as that. So I think Peterson has some very good points in his study about the social institution and family relationships and starting from the beginning. And for myself, I would say, I always felt that I'm old now. I have had a lot of experiences, and most of them were successful. There, here and there, I had failures. But I like what Peterson said. He said, you should start from the beginning, even if you have it together. You can still start from the beginning. And I think there's a lot of virtue in that. And starting from beginning, you start realizing how I could have done things differently and how I can move forward with them. So this is my take. I think he's very wise.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. I think people underestimate what immigrant experience is, because it is a very fundamental experience. You start taking a certain culture, and a culture is a very complex thing. It is explicit ideas, implicit ways of doing things, habits, the way you feel about things. It's like a one whole thing. And then you end up somewhere else, which is completely different. And then you kind of have to remake yourself internally, as well as figure out how to interact with the different culture externally. And it's a very powerful experience. So thanks for bringing that up, Jyoti. Next up is Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Well, my takeaways are mostly questions. I don't want to get into those now. I got a couple questions, but I was really struck by the immigrant story thing, because I've had that idea in my head now for about 3 weeks, that an immigrant story, the immigrant story is, how is it the same and how is it different from the hero quest? That's what I've been wondering about. And the immigrants bring wonderful things to a new place. They don't go out and come back, but you know, I'd like to get others, you know, maybe Jody's perspective on this. They don't go out and then bring something back to the old community. They bring something to the new community, and I think that's you know, equally wonderful thing, and maybe a more I don't know. I'm thinking about it. Maybe it's certainly something that happens a lot. The United States is built on it, and it's a wonderful thing. And how does that differ from the hero quest? That's just something I've been puzzling about.
Wonderful. We'll get to that. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Great point. Next up is Jean. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I found this question is quite interesting because I think a lot as a first generation immigrant. I think a lot about that. I think the reason American have so much livelihood, you know, because of the immigrant. Like when you come with a fresh perspective, you don't have the limitations. You know, like you come outside, then you know, then you can bring the new things to the society here, and America has the most genius way of immigration, because they either have to be very super smart to pass GRE, all these things to come here, or you have to be physical super fit to go across the border, go through the desert, or you have to be very emotional, like the au pair system. You have to be very smart or emotional, intelligent to be able to marry somebody when you're doing the au pair. Anyway, they have this most genius way of getting the best out of the world. So that's how they keep the system alive, keep the country so young, the fresh blood coming from the outside, the best of the best. I think that's how American is so strong.
Wonderful. I want to add one thing about that. I think America is different than most countries. Many countries have immigration, but America is different. You can become an American at a very deep level. You can't become a German. You can't become a French. Like you can be an Italian, move to France, live there for 3 generations, and French would still consider you to be Italian. And so would you. Whereas here we have a true exchange or intermingling of ideas. So it's a very deep point about we regard people as individuals and see what does the individual bring to the table. And so it is completely different than immigration. So it's partly America gives a lot to the immigrants by being open to different people, and immigrants bring a lot to America because they bring all their values, all their knowledge, and they can actually exercise it here. So what you get is you get all the richness of all the culture. And that's what America is founded on. So it's fantastic. All right, so I have 2 points I want to make. One on the side of the social institutions, value of respecting social institutions, and one on the point of creativity. On the value of social institutions, what I would say is that I want to point out to something which is actually a little bit broader than what Jordan Peterson talks about. I'm a student of history. So I regard like all people as my people, in the sense that it's a long continuation, right from our evolutionary heritage, then the first cities, the religious people, the people who came after that, you know, the philosophers in Greece, then the modern science, then the technology industrial revolution, the age that we are living in. So there is a continuity. So one very interesting concept I've learned relatively recently, and it's obvious once you start thinking about it, is the concept of retrieval. Because what happens is that with each progress, many times you lose something and you don't even notice that you have lost it. So William talked about kind of learning to appreciate religion. Religion had something. Now, I love science. Okay, I'm not religious, but still there is something about religion that was lost when you go to the science. So the kind of a unified perspective of regarding a human being. Even if you go further back at the tribal age, the kind of relationships that were possible between human beings who knew each other really, really well, there is something there. So there is at each stage, at the beginning of science, as opposed to technology, there was something. So if you regard all of this, that you are actually standing on all this tradition and learn to appreciate what you can of each of them. It takes work to do that. Similarly with kind of cultures, basically picking up everything, just like, I was in my breakout room, I was giving example of Ella Fitzgerald. She said, I love Ella. She said, I stole all music. Okay, so steal all of the culture that is there, all of the history that is there, and make it your own. So that's one in the side of respecting of traditions. On the side of creation, I'm very much in the camp of John Boyd, who talks about deductive destruction and creative induction. So when you take apart, firstly, you take in everything, then you take it all apart. Don't regard it as a whole, because many times, as Maritza was pointing out, that whole has walls in it for each level, and that is designed to stop other things. So they can't be really put together without kind of taking them apart as elements, keeping all the elements and putting them together in a new way. And I see both of these to be actually processes that help each other. The greater the base you have, the more elements you have for your creativity. And these are not arbitrary elements of just your imagination, but these are actually elements that are operative. These are like little things that go, little things that are living. And then you're like living ideas, for example, and then you're putting them together in a new way. So I think it builds, both these processes build on each other. So it is like you respect tradition in order to be creative. You can't be creative without having that base. So it's like a chronological thing. If you're entering a field, you have to respect it enough to master it enough to be able to do something with it, which is actually adding value. Otherwise, what you will do is going to be a fad, something that might work in a very narrow context, and you will miss out on all the things that it's part of things. So that's what I wanted to say. Becky, you're next.
I wanted to comment on something you said. When we look at a snapshot in time, you have creativity versus conservatism. But when you take time into consideration, that creativity that once was the opposite gets absorbed into conservatism. And then because it has been tried and it succeeded. And then you have new creativity coming in.
Absolutely. Very, very well put. Thanks. All right. So Claire, Roger, and Victor, do you guys have any takeaways?
Actually, I can go.
Go ahead.
So in the first chapter, there are so many good things. And there's one place where he discusses how we make decisions. And he mentions how the organisms have developed and how do we pick up the outside world's inputs. So whatever the stimulant that is out there. So that part, how he mentioned about neurons and how we as an evolved, well, comparatively evolved species, how we make decisions and how many choices we have. So that part really blew me. So that was really interesting for me.
Wonderful, thank you. Roger or Claire? Claire.
I've just been thinking a little about why is this chapter in chaos, right? Like why does this lead off this topic of chaos? Because we know that, you know, this is one of many rules on a long list. And I think what he's tried to do here and what's so significant is that chaos is blinding, right? You can't parse it out. And I think that the ability, or what this chapter tells us to do, is to look at these things and not to denigrate them, but to really look deeply. And the question I'm kind of walking away with is like, okay, great, you know, we can't denigrate either side, but then how do we go about that, right? And I think what we know from just being together here is that it is about really looking carefully, paying attention, parsing out things, looking at every atom of the bathwater and figuring out what part of that you are going to let go. And so I think it was just an exciting way to kick this all off with you guys. And as always, just like blown away by the group. And thank you for everyone who's new. And of course, thanks to you, Shrikant.
Thank you, Claire. That was great. And I think, you know, it's just these conversations, they're so incredible. And thanks for, you know, stepping in and handling all the breakout rooms while I was gone. Appreciate it. Next up is Roger.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Victor said, there's a lot of great stuff in here. Although I actually want to give props to Becky because she pointed out something that I think Peterson does mention a lot, but didn't go into as much detail about the idea of the danger of over creativity and what that risk actually is, and the idea that the things that have survived, like we only ever have a reference point of the things that have actually made it this far. We don't have a reference point for how many failures have passed, right? How many options didn't work? How many plans didn't work? We don't actually have any way to even conceptualize that. The only thing we do have is, so far, this seems to be working enough to have gotten us this far, but any attempt to improve that is a big risk that you might just end up with another failure in the long list of history of failures. So I think Becky's point was a really poignant and important one to also make.
Wonderful. And folks, this is, you know, the way we do this is that this is highly interactive. And this is an open forum for anybody who wants to do anything really good. Like, for example, Victor is producing his great PowerPoints, you know. Roger is putting, you know, he's relating it to maps of meaning. You know, Claire is going to give opening statement. I want Claire to give opening statement. She always puts the right kind of emotional tone to everything. But I invite you to come up with your own thing that you want to do with each of the rules. If there is something that you want to do with a rule, ideally, I would recommend doing something similar for each of the rules, because then you can come up with whatever it is. If you do, you can go ahead and write to me. You can write to me either at 52livingideas@gmail.com. That's the easiest address to remember. And we will go ahead, you know, try to keep it short, try to keep it like 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. But I invite everybody to kind of take the extra mile, because what you would find is that the more you put into anything, the more you get out of it. And it's a great community, and you're going to get actually very good feedback that is going to surprise you. So not only most of the work, most of the value you're going to get is by putting together, what can I say about this rule in 3 minutes? I think that's where you're going to get most of the value, 80%. But that 20% is going to be feedback from other folks. So it's an open invitation for anybody who wants to put in that additional effort, and that is going to build on everything. All right, folks. So thank you very much. And thank you, Roger and Claire, for stepping in today. Really appreciate that. And we will see you 1 week from now for the second rule. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye, guys.